Okay, let's make a wooden travel case. Box. We're making a box. So about a year ago, I had a good friend's cedar tree fall in his yard. So I decided to steal a log of it and try and mill it up by hand. So the rule of thumb here is to, for every inch, give it 1 year to dry. So I tried to mill these about an inch apiece, and now a year later, I believe they are ready to be turned into something. Now, this good friend of mine has let me and several other skateboarders in the area come to his house every Friday and skateboard on his mini ramp. Here's a demonstration by my good friend Cody. So, my good friend who owns the mini ramp's name is Jason. Jason has decided to sell his house, which is somewhat of a bummer for all of us, but it is pretty sweet because he is going to be hitting the road in a camper and seeing the US. So we're all super pumped for him about that. It just so happened that everything lined up perfect right before he's about to hit the road that these cedar boards would be dry, so that I could build him something that he could take on the road with him. I also think it's pretty cool that all these cedar boards came from his house. So no matter where he goes, he's going to have a piece of our hometown coming with him. Now, as you saw there, I went ahead and jointed one side of the face of the boards flat, then ran it through the planer to make them coplanar. Used the track saw there to line up one edge, make everything square, and then cleaned the rest up here on the table saw. And this is what I ended up with. You may have noticed that I started out with quite a few boards there and only ended up with 3. That was because some of the boards, to get them completely flat and coplanar, it was below the 3/4 of an inch that I was aiming for this box. So I went ahead and just kind of threw those off to the side. Now, as you watch this video, you will see that I encountered quite a few happy accidents making this box. But more on that later. For now, I've got the 4 pieces of cedar that I plan to use for basically the frame of the box. And here's what that looks like put together. So I am planning on doing some dovetail joinery for this, but yes, I am going to cheat and use a dovetail router jig in order to achieve this. I am not quite there when it comes to cutting my own dovetails. For one, I don't have a good dovetail saw, and my coping saw is absolute garbage. But I haven't had a whole lot of practice at it, so I figured this would be the best way to go in order to make this box. I went ahead and started making the actual dovetails on the front and back. You can see here how that process works. You just make a center line on the board and then center it with the center of one of those pegs there. Once you've done that, there's pretty well no thought involved. You just use the dovetail bit there that I have in the router, and it has a bearing on the top that follows that peg, and then the bit itself cuts out your dovetail. And here's what you end up with. So from there, you have to make the pins on the other boards to fit inside the dovetails. So you have to make some marking lines on your other boards, then flip the dovetail jig over and line everything up with the pegs on that side in order to cut out the pins for the dovetails. Now you can see that the pin side has a different template for you to follow, along with a different router bit that gives you the correct lines to fit inside the dovetail. But as you can see here, I did not line things up correctly. There's a nasty crack there. Way worse on the other board. It looked like this cedar was just a bit too fragile for what I had laid out on the dovetails. So this was happy accident number 1. I decided to do the sides with some cherry, but this meant the whole process starts over. Now we're back to where we left off, but I realized I really need to figure something out with dust collection. So here we are. I have two side pieces with cherry and the front and back with cedar. So yes, I am still using pieces of wood that came from his yard. I said it was a happy accident because cherry is a far more stable wood than cedar. So this gives it a little bit more structural integrity. Having said that, I am not very pleased with the pins that are on the ends of the cherry. You can see there, they are super thin, and some of them don't even make it all the way to the end because they chipped off. I am going to address it later on in the video, but for now I just wanted to make sure that everything lined up and was as flat as possible. So I did a little bit of block planing here on the bottom, or what will be the bottom, in order to get everything as flat as possible. Then, after that, it was time to figure out the lid and the bottom of this box. Here I am making lines at the 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch marks from the top and bottom, as you can see here, in order to cut a dado through those lines so that I can put pieces of wood in the bottom and top that will ultimately make the bottom and lid. I am only able to make these dado cuts on the side pieces or the cherry because at the ends of these dados it obviously leaves a little square hole. This will get covered up by the dovetails that are on the cedar board. Having said that, I still do need to make slots inside the cedar board that are like the ones here in this cherry. But in order to do that, I have to go about it a little bit differently. First, I just ganged up the cherry boards onto the cedar boards there in order to make the lines exact. We want the dados from the cherry to transfer directly over to the cedar boards. But like I said, I can't just run them through the saw, so I have my plunge router here with a 1/4 inch cut through bit, and I just have to start at one end without going all the way through and end at the other without going all the way through. It's important to note to make sure the depth is at a 1/4 inch as well, because that's the depth I set on the table saw, and this one was not quite a 1/4 inch. It went a little bit deeper than I would have liked, but that's okay. I'll just have to address it later. Now I wanted to check real quick to make sure everything was lining up, and right here I made a horrible discovery, and that was that I put the dados on the wrong side of the cherry. It's supposed to be on the inside, and I've put them on the outside. So the whole process started over one more time. Okay, now that I got everything lined up like it was supposed to be, it was time to get back to these cedar boards and route out those, I guess they're still dados, they just don't go all the way through. And now you can see that I have all the dados lined up where they're supposed to be on the inside of the box and not the outside. I did end up running into a little bit of the router bit kind of trailing off on me there, but it's in the corner in the inside, so I wasn't too worried about it. Now I am making the bottom out of some red oak. And again, I do not have a resaw bandsaw, so in order to achieve this, I had to do it on the table saw. I am just cutting out 1/4 inch thick pieces of boards, and then later on I will be gluing them together. So with all that out of the way, I decided to go ahead and do a little bit of a test fit, and everything was working out perfect. There's the bottom of the box inside the box, and it's looking pretty good. Now it was time for the top of the box. I wanted to use this piece of Paduke, but as you could see, it's quite twisted. I went ahead and gave it a try anyways, but to save you some time, here was the end result, and it wasn't able to be used inside this box. Far too twisted for anything to line up. So this was happy accident number 2. I call this happy accident number 2 because I wasn't too pleased with the lack of cedar boards I was using. So, to make the lid, I had 2 other cedar boards that were a little too thin for that 3/4 inch mark. So I just milled them down to 1/2 inch, which is what I was going to use for the lid, and cleaned them up and glued them up. So now I had a lid that was 1/2 inch, a bottom that was 1/4 inch, and I was using more cedar boards. Like I said, these came from his house, so it worked out better in the end that we were using more cedar rather than not. But first, it was that lovely time of any woodworking project, sanding. Once I got the sanding done, it was time to get these down to width and length of what the lid was going to be. Now, like I said, I went with 1/2 inch because I want there to be a slot at the bottom that is 1/4 inch where it will fit into the box. But then I want it to protrude up so that it is level with the rest of the box. Now, those dados are, like I said, 1/2 inch from the top with a 1/4 inch slot, and then there's another 1/4 inch until you meet the top of the board. So that's what I'm doing here. I am making rabbets all along the top of the board that are 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch so that I can fit the bottom of these cedar boards into the slots of the box. I know this all may seem a little confusing, and I am sorry for how I'm explaining it. But I guess I should say now that this isn't the actual lid. I will be cutting the lid out of the box itself. This is just going to be the top of the lid. Basically what you see when you look at the box. With this view, you can kind of see what I'm talking about. That bottom lip there will go inside the dados. And as you can see, this is got a little bit of wonk to it, but it's way more manageable than that Paduke was. Now, with most of the cuts out of the way, it was time for a dry fit. You could see there that I got most everything pretty well sanded, but I was having a lot of trouble getting this thing to work. It was very zero clearance, so I knew all my measurements were right at least. But upon further examination, I saw that those dados inside the cedar boards needed a bit more cleaning out. So once I'd done that, it went together pretty smoothly, as you can see here. It was still a little bit of a tight fit, but that's exactly what I wanted. It wasn't too tight, and everything locked into place like it should. Now that I had the dry fit together, it was time for the most daunting task. I had asked Jason if there were any symbols that meant anything to him, and he came back with me saying that the flower of life was a symbol that he rather enjoyed. So I knew I had to put the flower of life on this box. The question was, could I do it? Now, immediately you would think, yeah, just put it into a CNC program and get it done. Well, I don't have a CNC, and those are very expensive. So the next thought was, well, just use a router. But as you can see there, this is not something you want to use a router with. One little mishap and the whole thing would be ruined. So that left me with only one other option, carving it out. Now, I don't have any chipping knives. I do have some X-Acto knives and a chisel. So that was my only course of action here. Once I got the whole thing lined out on the piece of board, it was time to, well, just sit there with the chisel and make what they call cut lines. Now, a cut line is essentially just a gouge where you want the lines to actually be. That way, when you go back in to chisel out pieces of wood, the whole thing's not just going to chip up. There will be a cut line there stopping it from chipping the rest of the wood. I went from thinking I probably wouldn't be able to do this to, you know what? No, I'm going to force myself to do this. Because in the end, I feel like this made me a far better woodworker. I've never done any sort of carving before, and this was a new experience for me. And I didn't have the proper tools. Like I said, you would probably want to do this with some chipping knives, but being able to do it with just this chisel here and some X-Acto knives really gave me a good idea of how all this carving wood thing works. And needless to say, this took a very long time. I mean, I know I've sped most of this up, but first I had to draw it on paper just to figure out how it went. Then making the cut lines with the chisel there. And once I had done that, I decided I was going to chip out basically I guess it would be the negative space of the flower of life. You can kind of see there what I'm going for. Basically, anything that is a petal is going to be left raised up. And then anything that is not a petal, so kind of those triangular curved pieces there, I was going to chip out. And again, I've never done anything like this before, so it was kind of a learning process, trial by fire, if you will. Those first few ones were in the sapwood, so they were pretty easy. And again, like this is cedar, so it's not like it was hard to carve or anything. But you could definitely tell a difference between the first few that I did, and as I got further along, they got a little bit better. By the time I was working towards the end of this, you can kind of see there I was gouging out most of it with the chisel there in the middle, and then coming back with the X-Acto knife to chisel out the areas where it got very fine. So all the corners, the nooks, and the crannies were done with the X-Acto knife, and everything in the middle was hogged out with the chisel. I'm just going to slow things down for you here for a second so you can see there with the X-Acto knife. I was basically going along the cut line there as best as I could and gouging it a bit more, and then sort of lifting up with the X-Acto knife to chip the wood out of there. Like I said, it was pretty tedious, but I was pretty happy with how it was going. Then once I had refined the process of doing this with the tools I had, I went back and cleaned it up as best I could. It still looks pretty rough, don't get me wrong, and that piece chipped out on me. But I decided to kind of embrace the roughness, and the pattern still came out, so I was happy with it. Then I had a buddy come by and drop off his Festool for me to borrow. Now, I usually hate sanding, but man, with this thing, it was actually pretty bearable. So I got some sanding done. I sanded a nice little round over there on the top of the lid. And once I had everything laid out there, I kept looking at those puny little pins at the end that were chipped off, and I knew that wasn't going to work. So I grabbed this piece of Wingate, and me and the buddy who actually dropped off the Festool had an idea. Why not cut off those puny little pins that are on the cherry, then take the cedar dovetails and cut out a flat spot there at the top of each one of those dovetails. Take the Wingay and cut it into little squares and place them on the tops and bottoms to replace those cracked, puny, thin-looking pieces of cherry. So you'll see here in a minute once I get the Wingay cut that this was actually happy accident number 3. Here you can see exactly what I'm talking about. You cut off the pins of the cherry there, flattened out the tops and bottoms of those dovetails on the end of the cedar, and we've got a perfect square. Well, not yet. I had to do some cleanup here on the cherry. I think any woodworker would agree with me, though, when I say that this is probably some of the most satisfying woodworking that you can do. Anytime you've got to clean up saw lines like this one with a chisel or a plane, it's just super satisfying. Please ignore the dirty fingernails. Once I got those cleaned up, it was time to cut out the Wingate squares. Now, these were 3/4 inch by 3/4 inch, and I wasn't sure the safest way to cut these squares that are so small, so I just went over to the crosscut sled and played it safe. And now you can see why this was a happy accident. I was thrilled with the way that these Wingate squares kind of made the whole box come together. So with that out of the way, it was time to glue everything up. Now, for this glue up, I wanted to kind of mitigate the glue cleanup on the inside of the box because there's really no good way to clean up glue out of corners besides using like a chisel, and it's a tedious process, and I don't like the way that it turns out half the time. So I am trying to tape off the insides of the box. So any of the glue squeeze out that happens inside the box will be landing on the tape rather than the wood itself. And as far as glue ups go, this was super easy. And now that it was all put together, it was time to turn my attention to gluing on those Wingate squares in all the corners. For this, I just kind of lined everything up, picked out the pieces I thought fit best in each area, and then just took some little clamps and glued them on. Please excuse my wonderful cameraman work here. For some reason, went clear across the table where you can't see exactly what I'm doing, but here you could see what I'm doing on this end. It's simply just gluing it on, placing it, and then laying a clamp. With all that out of the way, I was getting super pumped with how this box was turning out. Like I said, most of the accidents were happy. The carving turned out okay, and everything was lining up. But I did have to address those dovetails and pins that were sticking out. And the best way to do this is with a plane. But first I had to sharpen it, and that's about as exciting as sanding. So, we're going to move on to the part where I'm actually planing off those dovetails and pins to where they line up with the rest of the box. Now you may have noticed I made the Wingate squares just a little bit too big, and you may have also noticed that the dovetails and pins stick out a little too far. Now this wasn't an accident, it's on purpose. That way everything can get cleaned up with the plane later and line up. But while doing this, it's important. You could kind of see there I was coming at a angle, basically right against the corner of the entire box to make somewhat of a chamfer on the ends of all of those pieces of wood. That way when you come across with the plane, you don't get a bunch of tear out. The chamfer kind of keeps it from tearing out on the ends and making big holes in the dovetails and the pins. I was mostly successful at that, except for that one little piece of cherry. But as you can see, I'm not going all the way to the glue, so I know that I'm going to sand all this later. I just want to get this all as close together as possible. And here's a little close-up view so you can see exactly what it is that I'm doing. A little bit of planing ASMR for you all with my son yelling in the background. But once I got all that planing done, it was then time to go ahead and move over to sanding, which I, of course, did off the camera. But when I sanded, I noticed a few things that were wrong with the dovetails. There was a huge chip in the cedar here. And then along the sides of the other corners, I could see some gaps, which these will have to be addressed, but not right now. Right now, all I could think about was turning this box into a box with a lid. In order to achieve this, I just set my fence a little past 1/2 inch, and voila, you now have a box with a lid. And come to find out, that tape on the inside worked out great. It caught all the glue, so all I had to do was peel that off and sand off camera. You could have seen those burn marks there before. I had to get rid of those. They sanded off pretty easy, but I didn't want to take too much material because then there would be a huge gap between the lid and the rest of the box. Everything turned out good except for that little bit of chip out there. I'm not sure exactly when that happened. I think it was probably on the table saw. But I went ahead and sanded it out as best as I could without making it noticeable. And here I am just measuring 2.5 inches from each side and using my cove bit in the router to route out a little cove, cleaning it up there with the juice groove card scraper and some sandpaper. This is going to act as a place to put your fingers to pry the lid open from the rest of the box. And you could see it there. Once all that was done, it was then time to turn my attention to the hinges that are going to be going on the back. These are just some simple brass hinges that I picked up from the hardware store. I am just laying out exactly where the hinges are going to go, and then using my marking knife and my marking gauge there to make, again, some cut lines for my chisel to go up against to carve out where the hinges will go. This is actually one of the first things I ever learned how to do in woodworking in Woodshop 1 in high school. Having said that, it's super satisfying and really fun to watch. Now, I didn't end up recording it, but I did the same thing on the lid as I did the box here. I just marked out the lines on it where they needed to go and gouged them with either the marking knife or the gauge there. And now all that I'm doing is carving out where the hinges will go. I believe that the hinges were only a 1/16 of an inch in depth, so I didn't have to go very deep, but I made those lines on the top with the marking gauge and then chiseled everything out to that line. I did about halfway through chiseling these out realize that I hadn't accounted for the pin that was running through the hinge itself and had to kind of on the fly there make little squares where it stuck out from the rest of the hinge. But that was a pretty easy and quick fix. So then all I had left to do was chisel out the lid. Once everything was chiseled out, I sat the hinges where they were supposed to go and punched a hole right in the center and made some pilot holes for the screws to go through the hinges. And once I had done that, I went ahead and just attached one screw on each side of the hinge just so I could do a test and make sure the box was being a box. Once I had ensured that the box was indeed being a box, I had to address those cracks and chips in the dovetails, and to do that I just used wood glue and cedar sawdust, and it turned out pretty well. Once I hit those areas with some sandpaper, it blended rather seamlessly. So now it was time for everyone's favorite part, which is applying the finish to this thing. And for the finish, I am going to go with bumbleshoots again, but this time instead of using just the B-Nuba hard wax, I was going to use their all-natural wood finish first, which is just a tung oil with some additives. It is still all natural, but I'm thinking between the oil and the hard wax, this is going to be the perfect amount of sheen that I'm looking for, with all the durability needed for a travel box. Getting into the carved out parts was a little difficult, but I was able to get the oil to get down in there. Um, the more difficult part was getting into that crevice in between the cedar and the cherry, basically the border of the lid and then the top of the lid itself. So I just used one of those little glue applicators, but instead of using glue, I used the tung oil and was able to get it in there. And here is the lid and box with just the tung oil on. And after that was fully cured, it was then time to put on the hard wax, which is what I'm doing here. Once the oil and wax had been applied, I decided to go 1.5 inches from each side to the center of the edge of the boards there and make some marks to then add some holes for some magnets that will keep the lid shut. I was originally going to put a latch or something here, but I didn't like the look of it. Heck, I would have done a wooden hinges if I knew how. That is another video for another time. But to get these holes made, all I did was mark the depth of the magnets onto the drill bit with a piece of painter's tape there, and then just drilled down to the marks that I made on the lid and the box itself. With all that out of the way, I was fastly approaching the end of this project. But first, I needed to install the magnets. To do this, all I did was use some CA glue and accelerator, and they popped right in the holes no problem. After that, it was time to install the hinges with all the screws this time. And once I had done that, we had a finished product. But first, I wanted to test those magnets and make sure that they were working properly. And holy cow, they were working great. Once you put things in the box to weigh it down, I'm sure it will be pretty easy to open, but man, it holds the lid to the box just fine, no problems. So this brings us to the end of the project. And wow, I am super excited with how this turned out. It challenged me in so many ways with that carving on the top. And like I said, with all the happy accidents that had happened, things that I thought were setting me back were actually pushing me forward. And I really can't thank Jason enough for being such a good friend these past few years. I really hope that this box serves you well in your journeys, good sir. If you liked this video and want to see more like it, just go ahead and follow the channel. Thank you.